네, 안녕하십니까. 저는 오늘 사회를 맡은 탄핵신문의 김현우 이사장입니다. 반갑습니다. 오늘 굉장히 뜻깊은 강연과 토론회가 준비됐는데요. 진행 순서를 먼저 말씀드리면 오늘 그 소바쿨 교수님의 강연이 이제 1시간 반 90분 동안 진행이 됩니다. 발표 자료를 보시면 아시겠지만 굉장히 많은 내용을 담고 있어서 통역을 포함해서 90분은 빡빡할 것 같은데 90분은 꼭 쓰셔야지 이 내용을 다 얘기할 수 있겠다 싶으셔서 90분을 드리게 됐고요. 그 다음에 이 플로어에 있는 청중과 질의응답을 30분 정도 갖겠습니다. 그리고 그곳으로 오늘 강연 행사는 마치고 그 이후에는 그 시민단체 활동가와 소바쿨 교수와의 그 자유로운 간담회가 같은 자리에서 있을 예정입니다. 그리고 그 초대받은 분하고 약속된 분들하고는 저녁 식사까지 같이 갖도록 하겠습니다. 그러면 그 소바쿨 교수님을 소개하기 전에 인사 말씀을 듣겠습니다. 오늘의 잠시만요. 보고 해야겠다. 오늘의 그 강연은 그 윤종호 국회의원님, 그 다음에 녹색연합, 환경운동연합이 주관하고요. 국회 기후위기 탈탄소 경제포럼, 그리고 신규 핵발전소 저지, 전국 비상행동이 같이 주최를 합니다. 그래서 오늘 그 윤종호 의원님이 아직 못 오셔서 한윤정 신규 핵발전소 저지 전국 비상행동 공동대표님의 인사 말씀을 먼저 청해 듣도록 하겠습니다. 나와주시죠.
네, 안녕하세요. 소개받은 한윤정입니다. 저는 녹색연합 공동대표입니다. 먼저 바쁜 일정 중에도 한국을 찾아주신 벤자민 소바쿨 교수님을 진심으로 환영합니다. 그리고 핵발전의 위험성을 알리고 대안을 찾기 위해서 이 자리에 와주신 모든 여러분들께 깊이 감사드립니다. 오늘 저희는 에너지 전환과 사회정의 분야의 세계적 전문가인 소바쿨 교수님을 모시고 과연 재생에너지와 핵발전은 공존할 수 있는가에 대해서 듣고자 합니다. 시민들의 열망에 힘입어 탄생한 현 정부의 기후에너지환경부는 화석 연료 전원을 줄인다는 이유로 재생에너지와 함께 핵발전을 더욱 강화하겠다고 나섰습니다. 정부는 정치 논리로 핵 진흥 정책을 채택했던 이전 정부의 전력 수급 기본 계획을 그대로 계승했습니다. 그리고 제대로 된 공론화 과정 없이 사회 경제적으로 취약한 지역을 대상으로 신규 핵발전소 부지 선정 절차를 신속하게 진행하고 있습니다. 이는 핵발전이 관료제와 전문가 중심의 권위적 거버넌스에 의해 뒷받침된다는 사실을 여실히 보여주고 있습니다. 올해는 영국에서 핵분열을 이용한 상업용 전기 생산이 시작된 지 70년이 되는 해입니다. 그동안의 끊임없는 연구에도 불구하고 핵사고 위험과 폐기물 처리에 대한 대안은 나오지 못했습니다. 핵사고란 체르노빌이나 후쿠시마처럼 거대한 폭발사고뿐만 아니라 일상적인 방사능 유출로 인한 주민들의 건강 문제나 핵 오염수 방류에 따른 해양 오염까지도 포함합니다. 지금 대한민국은 중대한 기로에 서 있습니다. 중앙 집중식 경제성장 일변도의 정책에서 벗어나서 자치와 분권에 기반한 안전하고 정의로운 공동체를 만들어야 할 때입니다. 국가 경제 발전을 이유로 핵발전소 지역의 희생을 강요하고 초고압 송전선을 건설해서 수많은 지역을 쑥대밭으로 만드는 에너지 정책으로는 누구의 안전과 행복도 담보할 수 없습니다. 오늘 소바쿨 교수님의 강연에는 핵발전이 비단 에너지의 문제가 아니라 진정한 민주주의, 지역과 세대 간 정의의 문제와 맞닿아 있으며 이를 위해서 어떤 에너지 전환이 필요한지에 대한 지혜를 주시리라고 기대됩니다. 저희 신규 핵발전소 저지 전국 비상행동은 오늘 이 자리에서 얻은 통찰을 무기로 삼아서 정부의 핵폭주를 멈춰 세우는 데 최선을 다하겠습니다. 다시 한번 이 자리에 와주신 모든 분들께 감사드립니다.
네, 그러면은 본 강연을 시작하겠는데요. 오늘 강연을 해주실 소바쿨 박사님은 발음이 어렵습니다. 서섹스 대학교 에너지 정책과 교수고요. 그다음 보스턴 대학교에서 지구 환경학과를 또 가르치고 맡고 계십니다. 그다음에 아로스 대학교 석좌 교수도 맡고 계시고 굉장히 많은 연구 그리고 연구를 종합한 연구를 하고 계세요. 그래서 지금 세계의 핵산업과 핵기술과 경제, 정치, 사회가 어떻게 변화하고 있는지를 가장 객관적으로 살펴보고 전해주실 수 있으리라고 생각합니다. 그리고 오늘 주최 측이 한국에서 탈핵을 지향하는 것은 분명합니다. 그렇지만 우리가 단지 소바쿨 교수님한테 탈핵이 옳다라는 것을 확인받고자 이렇게 강연을 듣는 건 아니라고 생각합니다. 더 많은 것들을 우리가 살펴보고 비판적인 조망을 공유하고 그다음에 우리가 더 알아야 될 것은 없는지 더 지혜롭게 토론을 해야 될 것은 없는지 그런 쪽으로 많은 어떤 인사이트를 주실 그런 강연을 기대해도 될 것 같습니다. 그러면은 소바쿨 교수님 박수로 모시겠습니다.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Kim, for inviting me here. And I also want to thank Dr. Dasan Lee, who's here from KAIST, who's been my host over the past few days and who brought me to Seoul on the train all the way from Daejeon. So thank you as well, Dr. Lee. It's really a pleasure to give this talk because I think, as you'll see, South Korea is known around the world for its embracement of nuclear power. And many of the nuclear power states, like the United States, Russia, etc., also acknowledge South Korea's leadership here. And for anyone who has been paying attention, you'll know we are in the middle of a climate emergency. The urgency for climate action has almost never been greater. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is telling us that we may hit a 4-degree Celsius change of temperature by end of this century. So nuclear power, civilian commercial nuclear electricity, has long been seen as one of the biggest solutions we have to mitigate climate change. In the energy policy space, this article here that you can see on the presentation from Pakala and Sokolo from 2004, so it's 22 years old, published by these Princeton scholars in the prestigious journal Science, mapped out in 2004 pathways to fight climate change. They called them stabilization wedges. It's called a wedge because it equates to gigatons of carbon that you actually displace from emitting. And nuclear power was one of only 5 wedges for electricity. The others were hydrogen and wind and solar, but nuclear was there. You can also see here on the right is The Economist, the magazine, calculated globally what efforts have been most successful at actually reducing emissions around the world. And you can see the Montreal Protocol is number 1. That's the protocol that helped phase out, here comes the big word, chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, which has emitted, or at least reduced, about 5.6 billion tons of emissions. Number 2 is hydropower. It's been around a lot longer than nuclear power. And number 3 is nuclear power. So historically, nuclear power is the 3rd best thing we've done to cut emissions. You can even see here in the graphic, it's even more emissions than China's one-child policy, which is also a very significant reduction of emissions. More emissions saved, as you can see in this graphic, than protecting the Amazon in Brazil, more emissions saved than transportation standards for cars in the United States. And you can also see here, more recently in the bottom left, article in Energy Digest from 2023, so just 2 years ago, saying the future is now bright for nuclear power. Is it again a nuclear renaissance? And this was before Trump was reelected and has even put more support for nuclear power. Just this month, new article was published from these colleagues of mine in the journal Science that has updated those climate stabilization wedges from 2004 to 2026. And I know there's a lot of wedges here, but you can still see, if you've got good eyes, the third one up there is build more nuclear reactors. So it is still discussed this month in the scientific literature as a key low-carbon technology. I probably don't need to share these slides with you, but this is from the United States Department of Energy. The Energy Information Administration tracks energy production, supply, innovation, and technology. And I think you can see this is from 2026, so I grabbed this a few weeks before coming to South Korea. It's interesting here that you can see South Korea is particularly well positioned with nuclear power all across the country. You haven't concentrated reactors in any one place. You're also unique. These red items are the only items that are shut down. So in the United States, you have far more items that have been shut down. And also you can see in yellow how you still have multiple reactors under construction, which is also rare. The United States has not launched new reactor construction for 30 years, where Korea is already doing it now. And then, in case you didn't know, these are the top 5 nuclear generating states in the world. And South Korea is on the list, right up there with the United States, France, China, and Russia. My students even call these 5 countries the nuclear elite, the 5 countries that are so ahead of all the other countries at generating nuclear power. And you can see this, I grabbed this from January 2026, South Korea to build more nuclear reactors to help address demand for artificial intelligence and data centers. China is also building, they're actually building a new dam that will be twice as large as Three Gorges Dam. So 40 gigawatts to be completed in 7 years for AI demand. And they restarted 3 Mile Island reactor number 4 in the United States, Microsoft, to power AI. So again, AI is certainly complicating projections of electricity demand. That sets the scene for why it's gosh darn important to think about nuclear power globally and here in one of the top 5 members of the nuclear elite. So what do I want to do in the 85 minutes that I have left? Well, firstly, I want to give you an objective, balanced, neutral, dispassionate, and non-partisan. I'm not a political figure here. I'm not a member of a political party that will talk objectively about nuclear power on many dimensions. What about its carbon footprint? What about its construction costs? Is it safe? Is it sustainable? Is it equitable? I want to say that I have no personal stake as an investor or advocate. I'm not getting paid by the renewable energy industry. I'm also not getting paid by any anti-nuclear advocates. I really do come at this as a kind of agnostic scholar. And I once joked, I've done a lot of this research as a hobby. That's what us professors do. We do things for hobbies, we write papers. And I do it because I'm passionate. I think it's really important to think critically about the electricity options that we have. Lastly, all of the data I'm about to present to you, we will share. It's all peer-reviewed. It is all published in the scientific literature. It is all open access. And if you have trouble getting it, email me and I will share it, because transparency, when you talk about nuclear, transparency is critical to having an objective debate. And if someone won't share information with you, that also may be some telling of ulterior motives. So let us begin. The first aspect is probably the simplest, and it is nuclear power low carbon or not? Now you may think, this is a stupid question. Of course it's low carbon, because everyone talks about how it's carbon free. That's actually not the case. Nuclear energy, in fact, all energy systems have life cycle emissions. that happen from the cradle to the grave of the nuclear life cycle. From fuel extraction and mining and minerals to fuel preparation and transportation and assemblage, to plant construction, to power plant operation, to power plant decommissioning, to spent nuclear fuel storage and land remediation. All of those use energy, which means even solar and wind have carbon footprints. So to answer this question, what is the carbon footprint from nuclear power? I did this 20 years ago when I was at the National University of Singapore. They had a great energy program looking at the School of Public Policy, and we looked at 103 studies. Back then, that was a lot of studies. I know now people publish a lot more, but back then in 2005, having 100 studies to look at was really interesting. But when we started to look into those studies, we found most of them were not very good. So we created different criteria to evaluate the rigor of those studies. The first thing we did is we excluded anything that may be too old, which makes sense. Nuclear reactor designs from the 1950s have very little to do with reactor designs from the 2000s, with very little to do with Generation 4, Generation 5 designs now. We also excluded those that didn't actually include carbon emissions. They may have talked about emissions of water, emissions of particulate matter, emissions of, of radiation, but not carbon. So we excluded those that were out of scope. We also excluded those that didn't present new data. So they may have just mentioned someone else's study. They cited it, but they didn't actually generate a unique carbon footprint. They were not what we use in the academic original contributions. And lastly, we excluded any that were not in English. My apologies, back at that time, Google Translate wasn't really working, and so we couldn't read Korean, Japanese, Chinese. So there will be a bias in our assessment towards English, Global North, European, and American studies. And we also did not include studies that we couldn't get the data. We needed the data. So if authors wouldn't share their data or it was proprietary or commercialized, we didn't do that. We weren't able to access it. That does mean that those 19 studies, though, at that time were pretty darn good. At the time of the study, they were all recent, published within the last 10 years. They were all accessible to the public. Again, that really important criterion of transparency and accountability. They were all transparent about their methodology. They provided very clear equivalent greenhouse gas emissions numbers that were broken out by the nuclear fuel cycle, which is also important, and I'll show you those fuel cycles in a moment. And we weighted the studies equally. We didn't want to privilege a study from Princeton versus one from, say, a public school. And so we didn't normalize the data, we didn't alter the data, we present the data as is, which we thought was very pure. So we're not modifying the study's findings, we're just synthesizing the evidence, which is why it's called a meta-survey and not meta-analysis, if you want to get really into the specifics of details. At the time, most commercial nuclear reactors ran of only one of two fuel cycles. Canada's a bit weird with their CANDU reactors, and some small modular reactor designs follow different procedures, but the bulk of the world's commercial nuclear fleet either uses the once-through fuel cycle on the left, which is very inefficient. My beloved United States follows this fuel cycle. They don't reprocess uranium because they're concerned about weapons proliferation. And they had the hubris to presume there would be a permanent geologic storage facility at Yucca Mountain, which has never been completed. President Obama and the Blue Ribbon Commission canceled it. But the United States and some other countries use that one on the left, which includes uranium mining, uranium milling, fuel conversion, fuel enrichment, fuel fabrication using centrifuges. Already that's some very energy intensive processes. Then you have the reactor, which is where electricity is generated. And then you have a whole back end of fuel processing and conditioning and storage, both interim, temporary, spent fuel storage, and permanent geologic storage. Others, like France, and Japan used the one on the right, where it's called the closed nuclear fuel cycle, which doesn't just spit out waste, you try to reuse and recycle the waste, periodically inserting new fuel rods. And here's what we found based on those criteria and those different fuel cycles. We found that the average carbon footprint for a nuclear reactor is 66 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent. So we converted other greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, sulfur fluoride, hexafluoride, and so forth, into a carbon equivalent. And you can also see, perhaps surprisingly, even operation has some carbon emissions, which you wouldn't think, because remember, it's supposed to be carbon-free generation of electricity. But that's not true. When a nuclear plant goes down for refueling, it may take 2 or 3 months. So you have to use energy to back it up. And there are a lot of unplanned outages at nuclear facilities. Some of these could almost be movies, like a cat tripped a wire at one of the reactors in Ohio and caused a 6-month outage. A cat. Others have been caused by mice and other kind of hilarious things. But you can see here on this diagram, the front end of the fuel cycle is where most of the emissions are. And that's all of those things I mentioned, uranium mining, uranium milling, uranium enrichment, which are often happening not where nuclear power is used. They're usually happening in countries like Kazakhstan, Niger, Canada, Australia, where the world gets a huge amount of its uranium. Interestingly, this number of 66 has been validated by 2 other peer-reviewed studies. So I guess the meta-survey we did was fairly good. And you can see here, these are colleagues in Europe at the Energy Institute in Belgium that found that actually there are 2 classes of reactors. There are some very low carbon reactors that are emitting around 8 and 58, so between 8 and 58, say 30. And then there's another class of reactors that are doing more than 110. So 66 is pretty good, right? It's capturing both ranges, the kind of more efficient, lower carbon ones and the other ones that are a bit higher than 100. And then here's another one from Yale that actually is giving further nuance of finding 3 clusters, a cluster of 13, a cluster of 23, and a cluster of 220. I should note that 220 number and the 110 number there do have carbon footprints that are close to natural gas. Hyper-efficient combined cycle gas turbine plants can get you emissions with high-grade gas and low transportation distances at that range. So that's also quite shocking, that some of the more poorly performing nuclear reactors have a carbon footprint the same as natural gas. What does this mean when you compare to other energy sources? You can see here, there's that 66 number, which I just tediously and painstakingly gave to you. You can see it's pretty good. It's not as bad as coal, which is 1,000 grams of CO2. It's not as bad as fracking natural gas, which is 600. So nuclear is 10 times better than fracked gas. But it's not as good as hydro. Hydro is 10. Hydro has, 1/6 the emissions of nuclear power. Biogas is 11. Wind is 31. So wind power has half the carbon footprint of nuclear power. So you can start to kind of see how it sits across all these other options. And that can be a debate that we have. Is 66 too high? Or is it still good enough, given that the fossil fuels are all emitting hundreds and hundreds of grams compared to nuclear's 66? Another study we did, published in Nature Energy, asked a slightly different question. It didn't look at the carbon intensity of reactors. It looked at nations. And the question here was really interesting. Do nations that adopt nuclear energy decarbonize? Do they mitigate emissions faster than nations that adopt renewables? The answer is no. And so what we did a complex statistical analysis with my colleagues. You can see here, Patrick Goetz are both statisticians and data experts. They do data analysis for a living. Gordon and Andy and I are all science policy, energy policy scholars. So anyway, what we did is we used International Atomic Energy Agency data. So also we went to the nuclear industry and used their data, IAEA data, that talked about carbon emissions intensities of electricity portfolio pathways. And we found countries that pursue renewable electricity have much more significant reductions in emissions, in national emissions, than countries that support nuclear power. It also found, unfortunately, you can't do both. We called this crowding out. Countries that tend to go for nuclear tend not to have the resources, the political parties, the epistemic commitment to go renewable. And countries that go renewable, like Germany, tend to have the commitment that goes towards wind and solar and even shut down their nuclear power plants. And so you can call this path dependence, you can call it momentum, but it does tend to mean, for most countries, nuclear and renewable are mutually exclusive. Countries need to choose one and do it well. They likely won't do both. And so what we said is, soberingly, it seems that policymakers need to choose between nuclear and renewables. They can't do both, or do the portfolio strategy where they have them all together. And we even went a step further and said, if you care about carbon emissions reductions, and that's all that you care about, you should do renewables rather than nuclear power. That's our first dimension of carbon. But of course, carbon isn't all that matters. Energy affordability, energy and cost is another really important one. And here we've published articles in the energy studies journals talking about construction costs. So for the first part of the study, we built a data set. This is great when you've got postdocs that can kind of spend 6 months collecting data for you. So we built an original data set of more than 400 energy projects across 57 countries, almost $1 trillion of investment, and 343,000 megawatts of installed capacity. That's a pretty big chunk of energy infrastructure. We found there's a cost overrun, or in other words, costs are underestimated in 75% of projects. And the average construction time, we looked at all energy infrastructure projects. So we looked at nuclear, hydro, wind, solar, thermal generation plants, that's coal and gas, and we also looked at transmission, electricity transmission and distribution networks. And you can see the mean construction time across the whole sample of all of those projects was 73 months, and a mean cost overrun of almost $1 billion. So in other words, any energy system you build is financially risky, because it's going to cost more than you think and take longer than you planned for. But nuclear power is the worst across all of those energy systems. We had 180 nuclear reactors in our sample, right? And they accounted for 60% of the overruns across our entire corpus, the largest of any technology class. Such reactors had a mean, that's average, cost escalation of more than 100%. I'll say that again. Nuclear reactors average is costing twice as much as you think, twice as much as you think. You budgeted $5 billion, it's 10. You budgeted 10 million, it's 20. You budgeted 50 million, it's 100. And actually, Hinkley C in the United Kingdom was initially budgeted for £5 billion. It just went over 100. So it went from 5 to 100. And it's about 15 years behind schedule. Interestingly, while 97.2% of nuclear plants had a cost overrun, only 64% had a time overrun, which is also odd. So you can't just blame it on time delays, because you would think most of the overrun must be things are behind schedule. That also implies even projects on time had an overrun. And that may have been why there was an overrun, because contractors were actually committing extra costs to get it finished on time to meet the deadline. What do we think explains these types of overruns and the incredibly high percentage? Well, number one, nuclear power was never market-led. It was led for security reasons from World War II and government programs in the 50s and 60s, like Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace project. Those were not done to make money. They were done for political reasons. Charles de Gaulle wanted nuclear power to reclaim the radiance of France. The US wanted nuclear power because we really wanted belief in the technological sublime. And I'll talk to you in a little bit about why China and India and even South Korea all pursued nuclear power. Also, anytime there is a nuclear accident, whether it's a major event like Chernobyl, 1986, 3 Mile Island, 1979, Fukushima, 2011, the entire nuclear fleet changes regulations because they discover new flaws. So the government literature calls this regulatory ratcheting. The regulations get ratcheted up every time there's an accident. And that's why Fukushima was so devastating for the global nuclear power pathway, because all the regulations and safety standards changed again, which also add to costs and delays. Also, idiosyncrasy in the United States, nuclear power plants are not very standardized. They're kind of like cathedrals. And so like Notre Dame Cathedral is very different than this cathedral. And so there, each nuclear power plant is unique. It's a standalone mega project that has its own idiosyncrasies, which make mass production very, very hard. And in the case of France, my colleague Arnulf Grubler has even demonstrated negative learning. That's where each generation of nuclear power performs worse and costs more than the one before it. Renewables generate positive learning curves. Every doubling of renewable capacity lowers costs by 20%. In France, doubling of nuclear capacity increased costs by 100%. So some of these explain why nuclear had so many overruns. And this just gives you the data so you can see. And look here, by the way, if you see on this slide, you should have the average time overrun, and the average amount of time it takes to build a nuclear power plant is still longer than it took to fight World War II. So again, these are incredibly long projects that take incredibly long to build, like the cathedrals of before. And you can see this does mean that nuclear stands out. Look at that that spiked line. Nuclear, 99% of the projects had an overrun. Look at wind, 10%. Look at thermoelectric plants, 12%. Look at transmission lines, 10%. And solar has none. It's so small, it doesn't even show up on the graph, which makes sense because solar is very modular and you can basically order it and then deploy it as soon as you receive the panels. And this also shows you how nuclear is unique in terms of the amount of cost escalation. When overruns happen for solar, it's only a few percentage points of the budget. But when they happen for nuclear, it is more than 100%. As I said, it's 117%. Even big hydropower projects don't feature that level of financial risk, as you can see here in the graphic. Interestingly, we then tested two hypotheses related to nuclear reactors. Do smaller ones perform better than larger ones? And is there learning over time? In other words, is the nuclear industry getting better at managing overruns? The answer is no and no. So anyone who knows R-squared values, these are non-significant values. So whether it is a 100 megawatt nuclear reactor or a gigawatt or 3.5 gigawatts, it has an equal likelihood of an overrun. So even smaller plants will have overruns. Also, they don't learn over time. Reactors in the 70s had the same amount of overruns than those in the 90s, than those in this century. Which is also kind of mind-boggling, because you would have thought that nuclear providers and construction operators would have gotten better at delivering reactors. So the implication seems to be it's inescapable, it's impossible not to have overruns when you build nuclear reactors. So we updated this study, by the way. This was done about 10 years ago. I had a lovely South Korean, of all things, postdoc at Boston University, Hani Ryu, and we updated the data set. So now the data set is 662 projects built up to 2024, 1.35 trillion of investment, more than 400 gigawatts. We had more nuclear reactors added to the sample, and again, the numbers are still 97.2% had an overrun and a mean construction time of 7.5 years. In this study, we also added some other energy sources, hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and geothermal. Nuclear is still performing worse than those, although it is interesting now that carbon capture and storage projects are third, which also means they're quite risky. Many people have said, what about SMRs? Small modular reactors? Won't these probably be a way around many of these problems? Well, my colleague Mark Cooper at Yale University says most likely not. You can see here where they're looking at the overnight construction costs for reactors in the United States and how he's estimating here that SMRs are still going to be much, much, much higher than commercial nuclear and also higher than wind and solar, substantially so. You can see there in 2030 that low bar is wind, that other green bar is solar photovoltaics. Even the most optimistic projections of SMRs are twice as expensive. And these predictions are coming from the SMR industry itself. They're not coming from outsiders or, as much as I like them, Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. So the industry itself is acknowledging SMRs are going to cost much more than renewables. All right, that's the second dimension. We're doing great. Now, the third dimension, safety. Nuclear incidents and nuclear accidents. And here I had the pleasure of teaming up with two of my colleagues at ETH Zurich, which is a top institute in Switzerland, Spencer Wheatley and Didier Sornet, who do quantitative probabilistic risk assessment on accidents. And many of you may not realize we follow, for nuclear accidents, this scale. It's called the International Nuclear Event Scale, or INES, and it rates nuclear accidents on a scale from 0 to 7. Here is also from Reuters, kind of putting it into perspective where you can see where some of the worst nuclear disasters have fallen. This was before Fukushima, so it's not on there. But an example of a level 7 accident would be Chernobyl. An example of a level 6 would be Kashtum, where there was an explosion at a nuclear waste facility in Russia. And a level 5 would still be pretty serious, like 3 Mile Island and so forth. Here's what we found, and I will explain these. We built a data set of 216 nuclear accident events. This is twice as large as the best data set that was available. We estimate that there is a 50% chance that another Fukushima will occur every 60 to 150 years, and a 3 Mile Island event every 10 to 20 years. So I'll say that again. It is as likely as not we will see another Fukushima within the next 15 years. We also showed a frequency of about 0.003 events per plant per year, which may sound low, except they aggregate, right? We also found that the average cost of those events is $2 billion a year. So even if it's not as disastrous as Fukushima, the fact that there are these nuclear incidents that require repairs, maintenance, refurbishing, etc., are also pretty costly. The last thing we found is that INES scale of 0 to 7 is woefully insufficient at capturing nuclear risks. It's not logarithmic. So actually, Fukushima should have been like a 14, but there is no 14. It's a 7. So we were urging the International Atomic Energy Agency to redo how they calculate nuclear estimates, like the way we calculate earthquakes and the Richter scale. We don't do it still to this day. So there's also a claim we're making about reforming the entire way that they calculate the International Nuclear Event Scale. Thankfully, there hasn't been another Fukushima, knock on wood. But we have also built another data set globally, because when we published this study on nuclear accidents, people said, not fair, you're not looking at other energy sources, nuclear is much safer than, say, coal or wind. So here, my students also built, another data set. You can see all these data sets getting built. and we were looking at hundreds of energy accidents in the literature. Interestingly, in terms of frequency, we were amazed, half of them relate to wind energy. So people falling off of turbines. If you've ever seen wind turbines actually getting deployed, they're these huge trucks that have huge towers and blades, and they can crash into homes, or drivers get frustrated behind the wind, the slow-moving wind truck, and they drive around and have an accident. Or my favorite, people looking at a wind turbine crash their car because they're looking at the wind turbine. So all sorts of ways. Helicopters can crash into them as well. It's actually a Mission Impossible movie started that way with the agent. But yeah, half of the accidents in our data set were reportedly from wind power. So the most frequent to fail is wind, followed by natural gas. But they're pretty low intensity. Maybe someone's injured, maybe there's one fatality. Hydropower has the most deaths. So here the nuclear advocates are very correct that when you look at energy deaths, hydropower has 180,000 compared to nuclear's 5,000, of which most of those were Chernobyl, which were 4,086. 97.2% of deaths relate to hydropower. And a lot of that has to do not just with the failure of a single dam. Failures often cascade. So one dam failure then leads to other dams failing downriver that leads to massive flooding. But nuclear is the most costly. So even though it's not the most fatal, and even though it isn't the most frequent, it is the most costly. Within that whole data set of global energy accidents, 91% of the costs relate to nuclear power. So when it does have accidents, it is super, super expensive. And then we also did another follow-up study that examined another portfolio of technologies from 1874, that's Thomas Edison's Pearl Street Generating Station in New York City, all the way to 2014. And here we also normalized it to energy production. So the numbers before weren't normalized. That was just flat out total numbers. And here, the kind of trends change a little bit. This is the same data, it's just plotted. One side is the pure data, one side is logarithmic. Go to the next one. Yep. So you can see it here. And again, when you convert to terawatt hours, accidents, wind and solar lead the way. Next slide. When you talk about fatalities, it's now wind and hydro. But when you talk about costs, it is still nuclear. And look at those numbers on the left, which is the pure numbers that aren't logarithmic. Look how much more expensive nuclear is in terms of its damage per kilowatt hours. That's $3 million per terawatt hour. So nuclear is almost a constantly running risk of some sort of costly incident or accident. And we're using only published data. I'm sure there's a lot more confidential, secret data on nuclear incidents and accidents that are not reported and not made public. In our data set, we had about 500 or 600 nuclear incidents. The International Atomic Energy Agency has more than 70,000, but they don't release the data. So if anything, I think we're underestimating the severity of these damage costs for nuclear. Right. Oh, sure. Why not? Dr. Lee got me this really nice baseball tee from Starbucks, which is a delight. The fourth dimension is called a co-impact. We used to call these co-benefits, but sometimes it's a negative thing. So co-impact is meant to kind of capture positive or negative spillovers from a technology. And here it gets more mixed because nuclear power does have some verified, valuable co-benefits. To do this, we actually did do some analytical work looking at equity and justice. We looked at 4 different energy transitions, one of which was nuclear power in France. Not South Korea, but France is still another leader. They generate 75% of their electricity from nuclear power, and they're a major exporter, and they were competing with South Korea to try to sell reactors to the UAE. And you can see here we did identify a variety of negative co-impacts in France. I won't get into what some of this means. It's just we had a triangulated research design that used research interviews, focus groups, and information from the intranet. And that's where it says supported by. It means anytime you see all three it's triangulated across our data sources. So you can see here, there are these concerns that in France, the French EDF and this CEA are arguing it does have high costs for taxpayers. There are a risk of accidents. There is this risk of crowding out renewable investment in France, which proved our earlier hypothesis about mutual exclusivity. There is a burden of nuclear waste. There is a risk of passing on high costs to customers. And we also were very concerned with some of the equity issues that don't just happen within France, but happen around the world at the global scale, things like uranium mining or nuclear waste. And you can see here, everywhere in red on this map is some injustice or unfair burden that the 4 European transitions we looked at have around the world, whether it's polluted uranium mining tailings in Namibia or it's the exportation of nuclear waste around the world. But as I said, not all of these co-impacts are negative. And so, building on some work from James Hansen, who's a climate scientist in the United States, we estimated that because nuclear power is still cleaner in terms of emissions, in terms of air pollution, than coal, it could save 46 million lives between now and 2040. So if we were to do nuclear for coal phase out to switching to nuclear, 46 million lives, that's almost the population of South Korea. Hydropower saves a little bit more in terms of lives, 46.2 million lives and 1,281 gigatons of CO2. And then renewable energy is a little less. That's wind and solar at 41.2. We also did this work in France asking about the positive co-benefits to the French nuclear transition. And here you can see there are 30 of them. Cheap electricity, articulation of national power and identity, supporting industrial growth, having national pride, helping enable France to phase out of other carbon-intensive energies, having cleaner local air, and so forth. So there isn't to say that there's no benefit, no value to doing nuclear power. Another thing we found, because in the renewable energy literature, one of the big things people oppose wind turbines for is birds and bats. And so this is called, in the literature, avian mortality. So we actually did a study trying to get an assessment of, well, how bad are wind turbines for birds? And it turns out we looked at estimates of avian mortality at nuclear power plants, at renewable power plants, and at fossil fuel plants. And I'll just get to the numbers here. You can see wind energy is actually very good for birds, and so is nuclear power, actually, because it's not having acid rain, it's not having coal mining disasters and polluted water that actually threaten and kill birds and so forth. And so here, again, there's an articulated case that if you care about birds, nuclear power can be one of the solutions to help kind of provide cleaner air and cleaner environment. And it is interesting as well, you can see there, we estimate wind energy killed about 20,000 birds in the United States, nuclear power about 330,000, but fossil fuels 14 million. And look at that, feral cats, 110 million. Yeah, so cats actually are much worse for birds than fossil fuels, in case you wanted that interesting fact. And then we also looked at a variety of these other impacts across different life cycle stages, which is just to say even wind has some externalities, as I said, with things like construction and power generation and decommissioning and so forth. And that's just to say that nuclear also sits in this array of risks with these other energy systems about how these types of externalities are balanced. And that led us to do this wonderful study with colleagues here in South Korea at Hanyang University, Jinsu Kim, Professor Kim. And here we built another data set. I feel like I'm saying that a lot today. We built another data set of externalities. Externalities are the hidden costs of energy, air pollution, accidents, and so forth, climate change. And we looked at 139 studies which had 704 estimations of externalities, which is a lot, over 30 years. So this is kind of like state-of-the-art evidence synthesis, just like we had done for the carbon footprint, but now for externalities. And we looked at them across the entire supply chain or fuel cycle or life cycle. You can see here, raw materials, manufacturing, electricity supply, transportation, and so forth. And we looked at a whole broad array of externalities, whether it's land use and degradation, or water use, or biodiversity loss, or catastrophic accidents, chronic accidents, climate change, and air pollution. And we found, surprisingly, an average amount of externalities of 7.152 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's shocking because the retail price of electricity in some places is 7 cents. And so electricity would cost twice as much if we actually paid for its externalities. And you can see it's not as dark as it should be. Nuclear is there. I tried to circle it in red at 5.63 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's a little better than the average kilowatt hour, because there's a lot of oil, coal, and gas in that number. But it's still not nearly as good as, say, geothermal or wind or solar. And you can see that here in this diagram that gives you the box and whisker plot data for these externalities. Waste incineration and coal have the most externalities, followed by oil. Nuclear is kind of in the middle there. Nuclear and hydro, gas and hydrogen fuel cells, and then it's wind, solar photovoltaics, and hydropower that have by far the least. But it's interesting that the electricity sector as a whole does seem to have evidence of a massive market failure, because electricity is generating $11.6 trillion in externalities a year, which is a shocking, gobsmacking number. It also means here, as you can see, things like geothermal energy are 155 times cleaner from an externality standpoint than coal. Wind is 5 times, solar is 3 times. You could also do similar calculations for nuclear, which is sitting there in terms of its externalities a little ahead of solar PV and bio-based energy. This gives you the externalities in that data by type. And this is also interesting. What's in red is climate change. But that's not the only significant color. You can also see blue is air pollution, and land use and deforestation is in purple. So again, there are also a whole other array of externalities. It isn't just climate. And what we found, again, the mean is 11.64 trillion. This, interestingly, is more than all of the revenues from electricity companies around the world, so it also implies a massive market failure because they're socializing all of their risks. I didn't mention it, but we also looked at mobility systems, less relevant for this talk, but it was interesting that their externalities are greater, which I never would have guessed. So in simpler terms, transportation's externalities are even bigger than energy's externalities, although a lot of that has to do with congestion, which energy systems don't produce. And here I did the math. Nuclear's externalities, if it is 5.635 cents per kilowatt hour from our data set, and you multiply that by the 2.67 trillion kilowatt hours that nuclear produced, you get this number, which is valid, where we estimate that the nuclear fleet around the world generates $150 billion of hidden externalities a year. 150 billion. If you were to add the transportation externalities along with energy's externalities, you get an even bigger number. And energy efficiency, by the way, has an inverse relationship where the more that you deploy it, it actually generates positive externalities. Most externalities are net negative. Energy efficiencies are positive. So I even tell my students, the first energy source you should deploy isn't an energy source at all, it's energy efficiency. Cheapest power plant is one that you don't have to build. So I'd rather do efficiency than even wind or solar, but certainly do efficiency ahead of, say, nuclear reactors. You can see as well in this book, we were talking about contentious questions like, is nuclear power worth the risk? And you can see we are trying to create, we're not in our research saying that we should abandon nuclear power plants and close them all down. We're kind of saying it should certainly be promoted in places where it does have a low carbon profile, where it has good, adequate safety, and also where risks are fully transparent and accountable to customers. So if you do it that way, I will not stand against nuclear power. I think you should also do all energy systems that way, that have certified emissions intensities and also have transparent discussion of costs and benefits. Another interesting question arises: if nuclear power does have these construction risks, and it does have these carbon intensities, and it does have these incidents and accidents, why is it done? Well, I think one of the reasons is that it's able to capture people's imagination. I love the term imaginaries, which is another kind of half Korean concept coming out of South Korea and the United States. We teamed up with this physicist, M.V. Ramana, to look at the visions and fantasies and narratives around small modular reactors. And we didn't look at the media, we looked at physics journals. So we went into the scientific literature of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the top 5 nuclear physics journals. And we found, you can probably barely read them, these crazy rhetorical visions about how SMRs will deliver risk-free energy, which isn't possible. There is no such thing as risk-free energy. But what a wonderful story, that comforting story that someday in the future we'll generate energy with no risks, or we'll have indigenous self-energization where all communities around the world can use their SMR to free themselves from the shackles of energy hegemony and colonialism. Or environmental nirvana, where we will have achieved waste-free, carbon-free energy. Or even water security, because you can couple nuclear to desalination of water. And yes, there was some visions we found in the physics journals about space exploration and taking SMRs to Mars, where you could have, the next wave of propulsion for space vehicles would be nuclear. But this belies that these visions also tend to repeat. We've had these visions before. In fact, Walt Disney made a film in 1943 called Our Friend, the Atom. And you can see here 2 historical facts that a lot of the SMR advocates have forgotten about. Up there on the left is the Peacemaker, what a name, which was a nuclear-powered aircraft that the United States Air Force did, right? It was because the idea was, what about an airplane that never has to land? It can stay up there all the time. And it ran for 50 flights and 250 hours. But it was a complete disaster. It kept leaking, there was radiation, it wasn't reliable, and it was scrapped in 1958. And here on the right is the Ford Nucleon, which was the plan for an SMR car. Again, imagine a car you never have to refuel. It's like the Jetsons. You could just drive it around, which was actually designed by Admiral Rickover, who also designed the submarine reactors that were the basis of the United States nuclear fleet. So again, these visions have been around for a long time, which you can on the one hand take as kind of comforting, but on the other you can also take as kind of nothing new. We've already had these visions before. And as I said, you can see here, there's the Walt Disney's Our Friend the Atom, and you can see Gabriella Heck's great book, The Radiance of France, about how French pursuit of nuclear power was about regaining identity after the crushing Nazi occupation of World War II. And we kind of looked at these visions across these kind of 9 different nuclear programs, including South Korea. And so you can see, why is China doing nuclear power? Well, it's not just for energy. They're doing it because they want to show they're just as industrialized as Taiwan, right? And they want to actually create economic leadership opportunities. France did it to recover from World War II. India did it to signal they were a modern country. Soviet Union did it because they were competing with the United States. Spain did it because they wanted to be involved in important research. South Korea did it, let's see if I got this right, to signal to the rest of the world they were no longer backward technologically and that they were militarily strong. Fair enough, those are good reasons. And Canada did it because they had a lot of uranium and they wanted a lucrative export market for reactors. And we talk a lot in technology studies about modifying technology so that people will adopt it. Electric vehicles are a good example. You need to get the range of an EV high enough or people won't adopt. So maybe the range has to be 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers, but you're continually modifying the technology to get people excited about it. We found in Japan it was the other way around. They molded people to accept nuclear power, which was especially important in Japan because they suffered the only atomic bombs that have ever been dropped on another country at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So how did that public get conditioned to accept nuclear power? There was a marketing campaign. There was an intentional pathway that Japanese planners pursued to, I guess I could say manipulate, let's say shape, to shape the public into accepting nuclear power. And you can see here, it's even in the title, Energy Transitions and Mass Publics, Manipulating Public Perception and Ideological Entrenchment in Japanese Nuclear Power. We also absolutely see a connection between nuclear power and the military. No surprise, given that's where it came from. And then we have my colleagues Phil Johnston and Andy Sterling talking about how, for better or for worse, there are very strong crossovers between Trident nuclear submarines and the nuclear power fleet in the United Kingdom. And they're kind of arguing that, you know, civilian and military nuclear programs are very hard to disentangle. Look at Iran and their nuclear program, or those from North Korea, and so forth. So there's a strong military connection to nuclear capabilities, which is why we have the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So what do I think this means? Well, I do think that nuclear energy is not carbon-free. Let's get rid of those words, carbon-free, carbon-free, carbon-free. But it is low carbon. It's probably dirtier than the advocates claim, but cleaner than a lot of the environmental think tanks will say. I didn't talk about this, but nuclear's carbon footprint will only get worse over time because we've already depleted the best uranium, and we've already reprocessed most nuclear weapons that have been dismantled into actual nuclear fuel. So because of that, because the energy return on investment for new uranium mines is great, and because we don't have many weapons left to reprocess and recycle, we estimate by the year 2050 that carbon footprint for the nuclear fleet will jump from 66 to 500, which is already then in the range of fossil fuels. It is also troubling that we didn't confirm the nuclear countries hypothesis in our recent study at Nature Energy. It didn't show that nuclear countries didn't decarbonize. They did. They just didn't decarbonize as fast as those that had adopted renewables. The second contention, though, and I can say this with much more certainty, nuclear energy will almost always cost you more than you expect to build. Even if it performs great afterwards, it's going to cost twice as much to get it. It will never, ever be completely safe, right? Probabilistic risk assessment, 0.03 incidents per reactor per year. So an accident will happen no matter what. Humans are fallible. However, it does have a few other co-benefits, right? It does have some benefits to things like industrial growth. It does have benefits like its military applications. It certainly has benefits of these positive visions and narratives and imaginaries, which can be molded, and it will always be connected to militarism. And on this point, I do want to conclude with some of the work that we have done on political economy of nuclear power, one of which was South Korea. So we were kind of interested, what is the political economy of nuclear energy? And what we created were like, there seem to be these countries like Germany that's now ideologically opposed. There seem to be countries like South Korea that are very much supportive of nuclear energy, and then there's countries in the middle that are kind of like making up their mind, like UAE. Oh, maybe we'll build a reactor and see how it goes. But we created this theory that nuclear power will only operate when you have these 6 political economy attributes. Strong state government control in economic development, centralized energy planning, linking active campaigns to link progress and revitalization to nuclear power, a very technocratic way of making policy by experts, making sure that you subordinate and minimize challenges to political authority, and low levels of civic activism. And you can see here, gosh, I hope we got all of these right since I'm in a room of South Koreans. South Korea was a military dictatorship during its early years of its program, which gave the government complete control over the policy agenda. In South Korea, the Office of Atomic Energy was placed directly under the president, and it was the Korea Electric Power Corporation, which was a monopoly. South Korean policymakers believed it was a very alluring thing to South Korea's economic development. There was a confidence in your engineers, probably at KAIST and other places, that you could design your own reactors and that you would have a degree of technology security. It says here that South Korea has a controlled parliamentary system, which makes it very difficult to challenge nuclear power. And lastly, this politically centered system has kind of really minimized any opposition that civil groups or people have had, or just overruled them. Let me say, it's not just South Korea. We also looked at Japan, China, and India, and saw all of those factors there as well, where you can see, historically, all of them are strong, although you can also see here, some of them are beginning to erode and to weaken, especially in China, with the rapid growth of solar energy and wind energy. And then lastly, we wrote a book, which I brought and have given to Mr. Kim, on the national politics of nuclear power, where again, you can kind of see these 6 themes operating behind nuclear programs all around the world: security, centralization, subordination of opposition, technocratic ideology, and interventionism, governments that are willing to intervene in the economy. And we have validated this whole book with 8 cases: United States, France, Japan, Soviet Union, South Korea, Canada, China, and India. What a diverse set of cultures, what a diverse set of countries, what a diverse set of populations and energy markets and regimes. And these 6 attributes hold true in them all. So we really do think we may have stumbled upon a really strong political economy theory of how nuclear power operates. And then we have these insights from that comparison of nuclear's political economy. The one I just said, that despite 8 very different countries, they all have a common development pathway. However, it is a complex and adaptive system. If you go back here, apologies, you can see, if you've got good eyes, it says weaker in a lot of those dimensions now than it did historically, especially in places like the United States and Japan. Fukushima drastically shocked the Japanese energy system. And in the United States, we had the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which was really pushing renewables and hydrogen and energy efficiency. And so the fact is, these conditions have to be there historically, but now, right, it's a complex adaptive system where if you erode the conditions, nuclear power stalls. It gets in trouble. Third, you need all 6. So countries that may only have 2 of those factors or 4 of those factors tend not to have successful nuclear programs. So it is a kind of all-inclusive framework that has to have all 6. The fourth one, national security, is present in all 8 of those programs. So again, this idea of atoms for peace, purely civil, purely commercial nuclear reactors doesn't seem to hold true, especially when you're dealing with those materials and you have that crossover of technological capability. Our fifth insight from the book is that climate change was accelerating nuclear power ambitions, but then that was counterbalanced almost immediately with Fukushima. So again, you kind of saw driver and barrier emerging at the same time. Another nice thing is the framework is political, economic, social, and cultural. And what we've said here is this means that deterministic accounts do not explain nuclear development. That's a term in science and technology studies about technological determinism that would say a new technology will determine its fate. Well, that's not true. There are all these other factors, social and economic factors. But it also goes the other way. Economic determinism won't explain nuclear power. In other words, even if nuclear power was free, you'd still have a whole bunch of other environmental, political, and social barriers. And what about political determinism that would say, oh, as long as we have the right policy support from government, again, that also doesn't account for some of the social and economic factors, and what ratepayers would pay for it, or that insurance companies would indemnify the risk of nuclear liability. So I think the kind of broad picture is you have to have a holistic, non-deterministic framework that accounts for this complex interweaving of the social with the technical, with the economic, and the political. And then we get to Insight 8. Nuclear power requires undemocratic conditions to thrive. And I'm saying this as an American, knowing that the United States is one of the 8 countries, and so is Canada. Who doesn't love the Canadians? They're kind. But even there, right, it doesn't seem to work. Nuclear power only spreads in societies that are unlikely to ground it in openness and transparency and full cost accounting in order for it to actually function properly. And in the book, we do talk about the accident risks with different energy systems in terms of fatalities per gigawatt year, and look at how high nuclear is. It just can't be done well compared to a lot of these other energy systems. As one of the former regulators of the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, said in the United States, you can have nuclear power be cheap, you can have nuclear power be safe. You can't have both. It also really implies these conditions of secrecy, centralization, the subordination of opposition, and what we've called peripheralization, actually complicate our ability to analyze nuclear power, right? Because the data is skewed. The data is potentially shaped by different actors. And so it really makes it hard to have full cost, rational debates that are fully informed about their energy systems. It also tends to mean that kind of autocratic policymaking and secrecy and control obscure the facts, which also make it very hard to resist or oppose nuclear power. It muddies the waters. And then lastly, in societies that do have transparency, and I love this word, economic accountability, that allows stakeholders to evaluate whether nuclear power is viable on the basis of safety or economic rationalism, then you don't seem to have nuclear power at all. It's resisted. And I think it also implies right now one of the only places that nuclear power is growing significantly is China. And China is anything but democratic and open and inclusive and so forth. So yeah, I think it's, when you talk about energy governance, it's pretty troubling to me that nuclear only occurs when you have a mix of optimism, arrogance, secrecy, and authoritarianism, where they kind of create these conditions of support that make it very, very hard to rationally evaluate nuclear power. And with that, I'll open it up for questions. Thank you very much.
긴 시간 열정적인 귀에 쏙쏙 박히는 강연을 해주신 소바쿨 교수님께 좀 박수 다시 보내드리도록 하겠습니다. 네, 이제 자유로운 질문을 한 20여 분 나누려고 하는데 그 동시 통역으로 주고받아야 되기 때문에 질문하실 분들은 자기 그 소속하고 성명하고요. 그다음에 질문의 요지를 그러니까 막 얘기를 하다가 결국 묻는 게 뭔지 잘 모를 때가 많거든요. 그러니까는 어떤 내용의 질문이라는 걸 분명히 해서 좀 1분 안에 말씀해 주셨으면 감사하겠습니다. 어느 분부터 아까 먼저 하실까요? 잠시만요. 그 순서대로 1, 2, 3번 손 드셨습니다. 예, 먼저 해 주시죠. 네.
네, 감사합니다. 소파크 교수님 여러 다방면으로 굉장히 많은 데이터를 가지고 발제해 주신 거 감사드립니다. 네,
자기 그 소속하고
저는 연세대학교 장미혜 교수님입니다. 그리고 국가의 에너지 환경 전문위원을 했고요. 그러다 보니까 지금 교수님 말씀하신 내용 중에서 정말 깜짝깜짝 놀래고 뭔가 타당하지 것도 많았지만 마지막에는 제가 기염을 토할 정도로 조금 당황스러운 내용들이 있었습니다. 일단은 제가 말씀드리고 싶은 거는 아까 그 탄소 배출 공급량에 대해서 말씀하신 것은 아마 기술적인 내용을 근거로 했기 때문에 맞다고 봅니다. 근데 제가 말씀드리고 싶은 거는 저희 나라가 그 원전을 한 게 뭐 과거에는 그런 내용이 있었겠지만 지금 저희는 가스나 석탄이나 모든 거 다 수입하는 국가입니다. 그렇지만 경제 대국으로 지금 5 국가 이상으로 들어가는 근거에는 원전 발전이 있었기 때문에 저희가 지금까지 여러 가지 산업 발전을 이룩했다고 보거든요. 그래서 정말 뭐 그 강제가 있고 자유가 없고 뭐 이런 국가
벌써 1분이 지났기 때문에요.
네, 그런 국가이기 때문에 가능했다는 그런 내용은 정말 말도 안 되는 근거에서 그런 걸 했다고 보고요. 그다음에 솔직히 지금 우리나라만 원전에 대한 사고가 있지 않았습니다. 그래서 그거에 대한 내용은 굉장히 그리고 이제 저는 막 그냥 무조건 탈원전이라는 것들은 아마 정말 잘 되지 않는 내용들에 근거해서 아까도 말씀하신 것처럼 저는 신재생 에너지 위원장을 한 사람입니다. 그리고 연구가 신재생 에너지 2주를 하고 있습니다. 그렇지만 보급 측면이라든가 실제로 우리나라 발전을 근거로 하기 위해서는 원전에 대한 기여도가 굉장히 컸고 전 세계에서 우리나라만 원전 사고 나지 않았습니다. 아까 0.003999%가 원전 사고 발생률이 아직도 있기 때문에 대비해야 된다고 생각하지만 저희는 원전하시는 분들한테 항상
2분이 지났기 때문에 질문을 하시거나
그래서 제가 이제 교수님한테 마지막으로 코멘트 비슷하게 하고 싶은데요. 저희 국가가 1990 몇 년도에 지금 여러 가지 지금 자유민주 국가가 된 지 굉장히 오래됐고요. 저희는 지금 에너지가 굉장히 지금 여러 가지 국가 사원에서 에너지가 굉장히 전쟁에 해당되잖아요. 신재생 에너지가 보급이 되어야 하지만 저희 같은 경우는 89기가와트가 일상적으로 우리나라 거거든요. 근데 33기가와트가 우리는 밤이나 낮이나 평균 부하가 됩니다. 그래서 원전을 깔고 가는 건 기본이라 생각하고 그리고 전 세계에서 지금 우리가 5위 이하로 우리가 원전인 기술이라고 생각하는데 미국의 SMR도 저희가 수출하고 있고요. 지금 UAE나 이런 거
3분 지났기 때문에요.
그러니까 저희 나라를 원전에 대해서 너무 평균 이하로 원전에 대한 기술력을 너무 평균 이하로 하신 거에 대해서는 우리나라에 와서 지금 이런 발표를 하시면서 정확하지 않는 내용 가지고 발표한 거에 대해서는 에너지 환경 전문위원으로서 정말 약간의 모멸감을 느낍니다.
시간이 너무 지났고요.
네.
다른 분들도 질문을 많이 하실 게 있기 때문에
그 부분을 좀 수정해서 나중에는 발표할 때 좀 수정 고려해서 해주시길 바랍니다.
처음에 너무 이렇게 되면은요 그 토론이 원활히 진행될 수 없기 때문에 양해 부탁드리고 처음에는 특별한 구체적인 질문은 없고 요청이 있었던 것 같습니다.
네, 죄송합니다.
그
뭐라고 말씀드리고 싶었어요.
이렇게 손 먼저 드셨기 때문에 두 분 기회 드리고 그다음 네 번째로 기회 드릴게요. 네. 그 다음에
질문 드리겠습니다. 두 가지 있습니다. 맨 처음에 이제
패스 바이.
Well, thank you. I really like your hat, by the way. Very lovely. Nuclear does have potential ability to promote technological innovation, which I think is what you're saying, that Korea could develop more advanced reactors that could be different than the reactors that are historical. But I'm interested, one of the things that I found when I wrote the book on nuclear power, new and old reactors have different types of accident risks. Old reactors have risks of malfunctions and maintenance issues and things like that. But it's interesting that some of the worst reactor accidents that we've had were at new facilities. Chernobyl Reactor 4 was only a few years old when they had that accident, and 3 Mile Island Unit 4 was also, I think, a year and a half old. So new reactors actually are some of the riskiest because engineers don't understand how they work very well because nuclear is so complex. And so I think there is this danger of sometimes the most advanced nuclear systems could be the most riskiest because we don't understand how they work. So I think we have to be careful thinking that innovation can solve that risk. Innovation may be the risk.
네, 여튼 새로운 기술이든 옛 기술이든 나름의 그 리스크가 있다는 답변을 해주셨고요. 다음 질문 부탁드리겠습니다. 네네.
네, 질문 드리겠습니다. 저는 비제한국의 김민호 기자입니다. 네, 질문 두 가지가 있습니다. 첫 번째로 질문 드릴 거는 초반에 이제 재생에너지와 지금 핵발전이 굉장히 적대적 관계에 있다라고 설명해 주셨어요. 그래서 특히 이제 어떠한 현상으로서 그런 적대성이 좀 발휘가 되는 건지가 좀 구체적인 좀 사례가 궁금하거든요. 기술적으로는 이제 핵발전이 기저전력을 굉장히 차지하고 있는 점들 때문에 이제 재생에너지와의 믹스가 굉장히 어렵다라고 평가를 하는데 그 외에도 그런 어떤 점들이 이게 같이 갈 수 없게 만드는 요인들이 있는지가 궁금했고요. 두 번째로는 그 말씀해주신 여기 안에 발표해주신 데이터셋에 한국의 데이터가 얼마나 들어가 있는지가 궁금합니다. 제가 뭐 대시로 알기로는 한국의 데이터가 굉장히 얻기가 어렵고 불투명한 것으로 알고 있어서 아예 이번 연구에 들어가 있지 않은 건지 혹은 들어가 있다면은 이런 전반적인 흐름에서 한국의 데이터셋은 좀 어떤 경향을 보이는지가 좀 궁금했습니다.
오케이.
Excellent questions. I don't know. I don't have the data set in front of me to go back through. I know we never excluded South Korea, so it would be in the carbon emissions data, the construction cost overruns data, and the accidents data do have South Korean incidents in all of them. But we've published the data set, and if you email me, I can give it to you. You can look at the data yourself and then see, because we never disaggregated any country. It was always going the other way to have a global sample. But that's why we build these data sets, so that people can use them. And so I'm happy to share all of them if you want them. We have them in Excel or PDF and things like that. Your first question about, I like how you called it antagonism, is a very good one. Why? We've demonstrated that nuclear countries don't go renewable usually, and renewable countries don't go nuclear. We don't really know why. We can hypothesize why. I think part of it is resources. Nuclear especially is really expensive, and you have to have a whole ecosystem of physicists, radiation specialists, nuclear physicists, nuclear engineers, and so forth. And so if you're making those investments, you're not making investments in wind engineering or in bioenergy. And things like that. So there's a kind of, intellectually, you're kind of committing to one type of science, and a very costly science too. You also have to have test reactors and laboratories, right, that are shielded and have radiation protection and all of that, and training. In fact, all of the world's nuclear scientists at the beginning had to be trained in the United States, France, or the Soviet Union. So again, it was kind of a, so that's part of it. I think part of it is also probably dealing with physical constraints. Like in places like South Korea where you don't have a lot of land, where are you going to put your energy infrastructure? And it could be mutually exclusive of this plot of land can either have a wind farm or a nuclear power plant. So you actually have, constraints, and those constraints can become really significant for solar PV as well, which needs large amounts of land to generate the same amount of electricity as nuclear power. And then I suppose, I think also economically, energy planning is always a zero-sum game of having limited resources. And so you probably have a budget in South Korea for energy, and once you spend it, it's gone. And so if you've spent it on solar, you don't have it for wind. If you spend it on wind, you don't have it for nuclear. And so I think the kind of financial constraints probably really explain that antagonism as well of everyone wants energy to be least cost. So they want it to be cheap. So once they've already spent money on a pathway like nuclear, they've already invested in it, there's a really strong degree of path dependence. Now that you have a KEPCO, and you have spent fuel facilities, and you have everything in place, that investment has been 50 years in the making. You're going to undo that now for solar? Maybe not, right? So there's that kind of historical legacy also creates this antagonism of we've made our choice and now we're locked into it.
네, 저희 데이터에 한국이 포함되어 있느냐는 것은 보편적으로 접근 가능한 데이터의 일부라고 말씀을 해주셨고, 재생에너지와 그 핵발전 사이의 그 시스템 그 충돌은 한 세 가지 측면으로 말씀을 해주셨습니다. 연구 개발과 투자 측면에서의 경합, 그다음에 물리적으로 그 입지에 대한 어떤 경합이나 어려움, 그다음에 예산이나 국가 정책 계획에서의 어떤 그 기회 비용 문제 세 가지로 말씀을 해준 것 같습니다. 그 다음.
예, 저는 한겨레 신문에서 온 최원영 기자로 갑니다. 첫 번째 질문은 앞선 질문이랑 좀 겹치긴 하는데 좀 더 확인을 받고 싶어서 그 재생에너지와 원전 사이의 구축 효과가 말씀대로라면 그 발전원별의 경쟁 관계를 이제 해소할 수가 없다. 이렇게 좀 이해가 되는데 그거는 발전원의 성격보다는 에너지 정책에서 벌어지는 경쟁을 제어하기 어렵다. 이렇게 이해하면 되는 것인지 좀 여쭤보고 싶고요. 두 번째는 그 요즘 이제 에너지 안보를 위협하는 국제 질서의 혼돈 상황이 계속 좀 벌어지고 있는데 이런 흐름이 교수님께서 말씀하신 6가지 원자력 정치 경제학이 작동하는 요인들을 더 강화시킬 것인지 아니면 최근까지 약화됐다고 말씀하셨는데 그게 약화된 흐름이 계속 될 것인지 이 두 가지가 좀 궁금하고요. 아울러서 하나만 더 여쭙겠습니다. 그 비전과 내러티브 얘기를 하셨는데 최근에 이제 빅테크들이나 AI 기술들 같은 것들이 이제 많이 조명을 받고 한국에서도 이제 이것들 때문에 원작을 해야 된다 이런 담론들이 많이 나오고 있거든요. 이게 비전과 내러티브를 또 다시 강화하는 어떤 흐름이 될 수 있을 거라고 보시는지 이것들이 좀 궁금합니다.
These are great questions. To the second question, I'm not really following South Korea that closely now. The book was 2012, so it was right after Fukushima when nuclear was kind of, again, facing huge questions about its efficacy and its safety. And I also, I think maybe I was here, but I remember maybe it was Seoul, or I can't remember if it was Japan, where they had a huge marketing campaign for nuclear power with kids' posters, children's posters that imagined a nuclear future. And I remember traveling around the country and everyone had seen those posters. And so that's kind of not even a vision or a narrative, but an artwork and ways of creating visualizations that can help promote nuclear power. It can also be an effective way of propagating these visions. But that would be a great project for someone to do, to kind of look at what are the different narratives here in South Korea and which ones are effective and which ones are critical, which ones are supportive. That would be a nice media content analysis. Your other question about the 6 conditions and where we stand right now in 2026 is also, I think all of those conditions are going to be re-strengthened with these global trends. I think especially all those things that I was critical of, the military capabilities, now matter more than ever, given there are multiple wars being waged right now, and given that the United States needs its nuclear deterrent in order for it to be a hegemon. And I think for the first time you may have seen President Trump decided not to renew the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And so we're now in an era, we're making nuclear weapons again, where we haven't for 40 years. And you're also seeing NATO countries now committing 3 to 4% of their GDP to military spending. And this kind of gets a little bit earlier about the question of antagonism or crowding out. That 3 to 4% of GDP that they're going to now spend on nuclear weapons, they will not spend on climate change or health or education. So it is kind of sad that we're going back towards a state of militarization and conflict. And I also think one of the things that nuclear power also does, because it is centralized, it's able to provide energy in huge chunks in one go. Yes, it takes a long time to build, but because the plants are so large, I think it satisfies what a lot of planners like in terms of ease. Do they want to permit 100,000 solar PV panels or one nuclear power plant? And I suspect President Trump would like one permit, not 100,000 because of all the transaction costs that are involved. So yeah, I think especially the militarism is probably the biggest factor that's kind of behind some of these conditions that's strengthening them. And the centralization of political control is the other one. Democracy is under threat everywhere. Council on Foreign Relations had a symposium last year. 97% of people living in democracies are at threat of their democracy being eroded. So 3% of democracies are functioning healthily. And it's like Denmark. There aren't that many. Sweden. South Korea is also not on that list as a successful democracy, given what just happened here with your prime minister, according to the West at least. Nor is the United States a healthy democracy. So I think that's also a challenge of we seem to be heading back towards autocracy, fascism, and populism.
그 질문이 좀 복잡했었기 때문에 충분한 답변 조금 추가하실 거 있을까요?
AI랑 데이터, 빅테크 관련된 부분만 좀 다시 한번 여쭤보고 싶은데요. 그 AI나 빅테크에 대한 관심이나 그 국가 지도자들의 어떤 정책 결정에서의 어떤 과도한 관심 같은 게 그 비전이나 내러티브를 좀 강화하고 있는지에 대해서 좀 더 확실하게 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
It's so hard. So in science technology studies, there's this notion of hype cycles, where technologies get overhyped. Hydrogen was there in 2000. Carbon capture and storage is also that kind of their fusion is another one, and they go through these different cycles. And right now, AI is at the top of its hype cycle. And we just published an article this year looking at projections of AI growth. It's all over the map. Like the range and the standard deviation is extremely significant, which tells me no one knows. They don't really know if there's going to be a no growth scenario, a low growth scenario, or a high growth scenario. The high growth scenario could be extreme. I've seen projections from Bloomberg that 10% of global electricity demand could go to AI by 2050. 10%. That's like China, United States, AI as the top 3 sources of electricity consumption. So if it goes like that, there is a very legitimate quest for energy security. Maybe we need to build nuclear plants or hydro plants and so forth to fuel AI. But I've also seen projections from academic studies that say zero growth. How? Well, you can make data centers more efficient. You can do demand response. You could have data centers that actually share loads between each other, so data sharing for data centers, and arbitrage, and a whole variety of other mechanisms that could still have AI, but you don't have to build any new power plants. Or if you do, make them microgrids and mini-grids coupled to geothermal heat pumps. And it's really interesting. Lenovo, the company that makes computers, even had a campaign a few months ago. You can look this up. The data center spa, where they use the heat from the data center to power geothermal energy that then has a spa, right? So again, these kind of neat ways of thinking a data center future may not just be as simple as needs energy, build nuclear power.
네, 선생님.
저는 한국양자정보연구원 원장입니다. 오늘 지금 키포인트가 제가 묻고 싶은 것은 우리나라 같은 경우는 자원이 없는 데다가 남북이 대치되어 있는 상황에서 전력이 차지하는 비중이 전체 경제 발전에 굉장히 중요한 요인이거든요. 우리는 다행히 핵 발전을 시도를 했기 때문에 어마어마하게 비싼 가스나 유류나 이런 것보다도 적게 쓰면서 우리나라가 산업적 제조업을 중심으로 발전할 수 있는 아주 키포인트가 우리가 그 에너지 정책에서 다른 나라보다도 경쟁력이 있었기 때문에 그렇다고 저는 생각을 하고 있는데 지금 원자력이 우리나라에는 원전이 아니면은 우리나라가 이 에너지를 충당할 수가 없는데 지금 정치적으로 좌파에서는 재생에너지를 해야 한다고 생각하고 보수 우파에서는 원전을 해야 한다고 그렇게 생각하고 있는데 세계적인 추세도 핵무기를 핵 원전을 줄여가 가지고 재생에너지를 하겠다고 했던 독일이나 일본이나 이런 나라도 포기하고 원전으로 돌아가고 있는 것을 보면 우리나라 정책이 참 옳았다 그렇게 생각하면서도 지금 우리나라에서 원전으로 하느냐 재생에너지로 하느냐 하는 그 키포인트가 뭐냐 그러면 그것은
선생님.
에피션스, 이펙티브, 아웃푸트, 인푸트 앤드 아웃푸트의 그
선생님.
효율성 때문에 이제 다 끝났어요.
네.
효율성으로 봐보면은 그것에 의해서 하기 때문에 우리나라는 완전히 우리나라에는 유리하다고 생각하는데 재생에너지를 요구하고 있는 것을 그런 이론을 어떻게 생각하시는지요? 우리나라 정책이 어디로 가야 하느냐 하는 얘기예요.
네, 질문 잘 들었고. 근데 좌파냐 우파냐는 이다솜 교수님이 대답이셔야 될 것 같은데.
아니 우리 지금 에너지 정책이 바로 그러거든요.
잘 들었습니다. Please.
Thank you. That's a respectable view. It's not the view that I share, but there's no doubt, like you said, that nuclear power has helped South Korea industrialize. You've had massive increases in energy demand, and you are a development miracle. I mean, in 60 years, your level of development, I mean, in 1950, you actually had the same level of GDP as like Myanmar or North Korea. And to look what you've done, like, that's incredible. It is incredible. And could have you done it with renewables and hydropower? Maybe not. But I still think to have an accurate assessment of nuclear power in Korea, what is its levelized cost of energy compared to these renewables? What is its levelized cost to energy efficiency? And then this is the key. When you're thinking about the cost, are you also including the cost of nuclear waste storage and spent fuel storage? Because those costs could be big. And then are you also thinking of decommissioning? Because those costs could also be big. When we wrote some of the research that we did, decommissioning could double the cost of a nuclear power plant at the end of its life. And if you want to look at a horrific experience in the UK, Sellafield, £300 billion to decommission that one site, when at the launch of the program they thought it would be one. So it is 300 times more expensive to decommission that one nuclear waste facility. And decommissioning is something that not a lot of us have experience with. So I think if you're going to argue that Korea should be nuclear, show us the costs that include decommissioning and waste storage so they're not just passed on to future generations, and then make a decision.
그러니까 핵발전이 저렴한 전기로 그 한국의 그 산업 발전에 기여한 것은 있긴 하지만 그 저기 아직 알수 못한 해체를 포함한 그 저기 숨은 비용 요게 앞으로 좀 더 중요해지지 않을까 그런 답변을 주셨습니다. 그 이제 시간을 보니까 한 3분 또는 많으면 4분 정도 시간을 잘 썼을 경우에 저희가 할 수 있을 것 같아서 그 한 번 손을 한 번 더 들어보실래요? 질문하실 분? 네, 한 명. 예, 이준 선생님 2분. 또 제일 후순위로 한유 선생님 예 3분 하고 추가 질문 드릴 수 있을지 모르겠는데 일단 보자. 예, 임재민 자기 소개 간단히 하시고 예, 질문 부탁드립니다.
네, 소바쿠 교수님 반갑습니다. 예전에 줌으로만 한번 저희 초청해서 인사드렸었는데 또 이렇게 직접 뵈서 매우 반갑습니다. 저는 에너지 전환 포럼의 임재민이고요. 예전에 저희 콜로키움에 한번 초청을 드렸었습니다. 제가 질문 드리고 싶은 거는 AI 그리고 데이터 센터 빅테크와 원전이 연결된 그 내러티브는 사실 약간 좀 허황된, 좀 포장된 내러티브가 아닌가라는 좀 의심도 하고 있습니다. 왜냐하면 실제로 AI, 데이터, 빅테크들이 필요로 하는 전력 수요들은 5년 내, 6년 내 굉장히 빠르게 좀 필요로 하는 전력 수요고 원전이 실제 건설되고 지어지고 인허가를 받고 하려면 최소 인허가까지 포함한 15년 이상 걸리고 또 SMR도 2035년이 돼도 될까 말까 하는 상황입니다. 미국도. 그런데 당장 데이터 AI 센터를 위해서 지금 그걸 건설해서 해결하겠다라는 것 자체가 좀 사실 실제 투자와는 다르게 내러티브 빌딩으로
질문으로 좀 모아서 정리해 주십시오.
네, 활용되는 거 아닌가 저는 의심을 하고 있는데 실제 미국에서는 어떤지 좀 궁금합니다. 실제 투자나 데이터 센터에 전력을 공급하기 위해서 활용되는 에너지원들이 어떤지 궁금합니다.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you. Yeah, the U.S. power markets are a bit of a disaster right now. A lot of the data centers are now doing diesel generators just to have near-term power. And the utilities, electric utilities, are often blocking requests to connect new data centers until they can get adequate demand. But a lot of that demand is met by gas. And in some cases, coal, because Trump is reinvesting in coal. And you may have seen, I couldn't believe it, he just offered Total, the French energy company, $1 billion not to build wind. So at a time when the U.S. needs energy, this president is giving billions of tax dollars to not build. And those offshore wind farms could have been operational within 3 or 4 years, unlike you said, 15 years for nuclear power. This is why Microsoft bought 3 Mile Island, because it was already built and it was already operational. They just hadn't fueled the reactor. So that was kind of the only, so people think, oh, we're reviving nuclear power. Well, it wasn't a new plant. It wasn't a new build, and it was also kind of an anomaly that it was available. It's because they had the accident and they'd shut it down. In other words, there are no more 3 Mile Islands that they can use for the next round of data centers. So I think you're right that nuclear probably isn't a solution in the short term or the medium term for data center demand. And here's another thing. 99% of capacity additions in the United States, wind and solar. Onshore wind and solar photovoltaic. So that would also imply that's the capacity in the queue. That's what's going to meet demand for these data centers that are coming online. Nuclear probably won't be needed in 15 years, in my view.
미국 데이터 센터들은 알아서 이럭저럭 전기를 끌어모으고 있다는 얘기고요. TMI 같은 사례가 많을 수는 없고, 그 다음에 윈드랑 솔라가 엄청 늘어나고 있는 그 미래를 말씀해 주셨습니다. 이준채 선생님. 왜냐하면 통역자가 들어야 하기 때문에요. 네. 마이크를 들어주세요.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 물리학이 전공이었던 건국대학교 명예교수 이준택입니다. 핵물리학에 대해서는 제가 강의를 25년 동안 했으니까 거기에 대한 근본적인 것은 더 말할 나위 없고요. 많은 부분은 소바쿨 교수님, 특히 뒤쪽 부분에 대해서는 굉장히 공감을 합니다. 예. 어떤 환경에서 이 핵발전소가 잘 돌아가고 있는지. 예. 우리가 이제 원자력발전소, 핵발전소 여기에서도 문제가 있는 부분에 대해서는 많은 사람들이 보질 못하고 있는데 거기에 그런 부분들은 진짜 우리가 심각하게 봐야 됩니다. 방사능 같은 것은 뭐 우리가 19세기에 이미 알려졌지만 거기에 대한 답변은 아직도 없거든요. 예. 그리고 또 이제 방사능 만들어내는 건 또 핵 재처리 시설도 마찬가지예요. 프랑스의 그 라아그라든가 영국의 셜라필드 같은 데서 그 재처리 시설에서 나온 그 방사능으로 대한 피해는 엄청났었던 거죠. 그래서 재생에너지 뭐 여기에 대해서 굉장히 비판적인 얘기를 갖다 하고 있는 쪽은 핵을 하는 분들의 얘기인 거로 알고 있습니다. 가능성이 있기 때문에 날이 안 좋으면은 이제
선생님도 질문으로
예,
정의를
알겠습니다. 딱 한마디만 더 할게요. 코멘트 비슷하게. 우리보다 더 햇빛이 안 좋은 독일 같은 경우가 작년에 50% 이상을 재생에너지에서 충당했고 이 사람들은 2030년까지 80%를 재생에너지로 한다고 그랬어요. 전기를. 그래서 2050년에는 100%를 재생에너지로 한다고 그랬습니다. 근데 여기서 이것은 가능성은 우리가 이제 배터리 저장 장치를 쓰면 돼요. 그 값도 굉장히 싸졌거든요. 거기에 대해서 우리가 좀 눈여겨보고 그렇게 하면은 충분히 이런 재생에너지가 결코 망하는 것은 아니다. 그리고 그동안 우리 뭐 한국이 하나님이 보호하사 사고가 없었는데 사고가 날 수 있는 그것은 확률이 정해주는 것은 아니에요. 지금도 굉장히 많은 큰 사고들이 굉장히 있었어요. 근데 우리가 못 봤을 따름이죠. 그러니까 우리는 좀 더 값싸고 쉽게 지을 수 있는 그런 에너지를 쓰는 게 좋을 것 같습니다. 많은 부분을 갖다가 말씀해 주셔서 굉장히 감사하게 됩니다.
질문 아니고 코멘트로 예, 감사합니다. 하윤 선생님.
네. 발표 너무나 재미있게 잘 들었습니다. 저의 질문은 마지막 통찰의 결론에서 5번째, 6번째 통찰에 대한 부분인데요. 기후변화는 핵 발전의 전망에 영향을 미치지만 후쿠시마 사고가 미치는 영향은 불분명하다 이렇게 말씀을 하셔서 아마도 이제 제 짐작에는 후쿠시마 사고처럼 그 자연재해로 인한 그 영향 때문에 핵발전이 저조해질 수 있다라는 의미로 이렇게 쓰신 것 같은데 또 다른 한편에서는 파리 기후협약 이후 신기후체제 속에서 기후변화가 핵발전을 지지하는 논리로 많이 쓰이고 있거든요. 그래서 지금 오늘 발표해 주신 2012년 저서 이후에 2010년대 말이나 2020년대 상황이 핵발전에 대해서 어떤 변화를 가지고 왔는지 그거에 대한 견해를 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
마지막 질문을 다시 한번.
그러니까 지금 그 저서가 2012년 저서인데 그 이후에 이제 기후 변화와 핵발전의 관계가 과거의 사고 위험으로 인한 핵발전이 그러니까 저조해질 것이다라는 전제에서 오히려 기후 변화 때문에 핵발전을 많이 해야 된다. 왜냐하면 화석을 줄여야 되기 때문에 이렇게 이제 변화하는 상황이 있었기 때문에 그거에 대한 견해가 어떠신지 여쭤보고 싶습니다.
So I think, the memory of most policymakers is surprisingly short. And that does mean that already Fukushima was more than a decade ago, and people have forgotten. And so you have a new wave of euphoria and hype that will continue until we have another incident, another accident. And I think there will be another one. And we don't know where it will be. As you said, God protect Korea, but it could be Russia. It could be the United States. It could be Canada. That's the problem with these accidents. We don't know. And they have natural causes like the tsunami, but also human-induced causes. And there could be one in Ukraine because they're currently still bombing the nuclear power plant in the Ukraine, which could also create a massive meltdown. Also, you don't have to necessarily target the reactor. You can take out substations, cooling towers, other infrastructure, and so forth. There was work done by the Union of Concerned Scientists about crashing airplanes into reactor sites. And there was even some cases in the 1970s and 1980s of where people did do that. They threatened to crash a plane into a reactor unless they got $1 million, which is in the book, by the way. It's one of the fascinating cases. And so you're right, nuclear power has these types of risks because it is unlike any other energy system, because of its connection to radioactivity, that it has spent nuclear fuel. So I think even if you like nuclear, it still makes it risky because you don't know at what next month there will be another Fukushima, and then it's going to be a whole other wave of regulatory ratcheting, of policy changes, and of people backing out. After Fukushima, 60 nuclear power plants were canceled. So think of all that effort and work and planning immediately gone in the blink of an eye. That accident took one day. And so I think there is, renewables, efficiency don't have those risks. And so I think it is a matter of when, not if, the next major accident will occur.
그러니까 리스크는 상존하기는 하는데 아까 그 발표에서 핵발전은 이렇게 뭐랄까요, 일종의 어떤 적응적 시스템이다, 종합적인 그런 이야기와 좀 상통하는 대답인 것 같습니다. 시간은 다 됐는데 혹시 기자님은 쉬는 시간에 잠깐 질문하셔도 될 것 같고요. 예. 그 질문 안 하신 분 중에 혹시 질문도 괜찮고 코멘트도 괜찮을 것 같은데요. 없으신? 손 드셨어요, 누구? 혹시 김세현 선생님 아니면은 초롱초롱 들으시던 조천 선생님 혹시 그러시면 아니요, 그 공평하게 기회를 드려야 되니까 마감을 하는 게 좋을 것 같습니다. 그리고 자료집이 굉장히 그 내용과 분량이 방대하기 때문에 좀 추가로 좀 살펴보시고 저기 메일 있으니까는 소바쿨 교수의 메일 투 닥터 소바쿨 하시면 되겠습니다. 그러면은 오늘 되게 2시간 가까운 강연을 마치고요. 그 기념 촬영을 할 거거든요. 그러니까는 이 소바쿨 교수 가운데로 하고 잠깐 나오시면 좋겠습니다. 아니, 그럴 필요 없고 사진으로